Good morning, everyone. As you come in on the screen, you can see we are introducing ourselves in the chat, putting name, pronouns, any affiliation that you want to be identified with, and either favorite song from high school, or if you had an AOL Instant Messenger, your AOL Instant Messenger name.
I'm probably the only person that was on AOL. And when I first joined AOL, they didn't have anything. There wasn't any such thing as instant messenger.
I love seeing these instant messenger names. It's hilarious.
Is that the same thing as my?
Yeah, that's your AOL name. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Like your email at the time, a lot of the times people had the same thing.
Oh, okay. I'll put that in there.
It's revealing what you named yourself 20 years ago, you know.
It's been the same. It was. I'm still the same. Old man 9.
Love that.
Someone also mentioned Ocean Avenue as their favorite, like having one of their favorite songs. Me too. So if you just came in, we're putting names in the chat with our pronouns, our affiliation. So if you're a teacher, student, etc., and your favorite song from high school, or your AOL Instant Messenger name from back in the day. All right, welcome. If you are here, thank you for being here. We are introducing ourselves in the chat with our name, pronoun, affiliation, and favorite song or AOL Instant Messenger screen name that you used to have. There's some very good ones in here. And we will be starting in 1 minute. Good morning, everyone. I think you can hear me. Yes, you can hear me. I am Chanel Jackson. I am a second year EmpowerEd Fellow. I want to thank you so much for coming today. We are super excited for you to be joining us in this critical discussion. I am going to put some numbers in the chat to help me organize the breakout room. So I'm going to ask you all to rename yourselves based on your affiliation. So if you're a teacher, you'll have a number. If you are a student, you will have a number. The biggest ask is that you put the number before your name. I'm going to share my screen so you can see the numbers and see an example of what I mean. Okay, here we go. So at the bottom, you can see I was renaming myself, I'd be putting it as 8 Chanel Jackson because I'm an EmpowerEd Fellow. So if you could take a minute to rename yourself based on your affiliation, that would be super, super helpful. And if you're not sure how to rename yourself because you don't use Zoom or you use something else on a regular basis, there are 3 little buttons in the right-hand corner of your picture box that will allow you to rename yourself.
Do you want us to do this to everybody or just to you?
I want you to just rename yourself right now. So if you click on the 3 little boxes in the corner of your face, there's an option to rename, and then you can change your name totally, and I'll see it, everyone will see it. Actually, let me do mine, follow my own instructions. So 8. And then it will rename, and we can go from there. I'm gonna give you guys like a minute or 2 to do that. Thank you so much. I will also put these instructions in the chat so you can see all of this information while I hand things over to another fellow, Patricia Stanford.
And real quick, before Patricia starts, welcome everybody. So we can see the featured speakers and panelists for the first part of today. I'm just going to ask everybody to turn cameras off, except for the person speaking. For now, I'll ask everyone to turn cameras off except for Patricia, and then we'll go to our panel in just a moment. And welcome. Hi, Patricia.
Good morning. Good morning. Welcome, welcome. My name is Patricia Stamper, and I'm an EmpowerEd Fellow representing Ward 6. I serve the students and families of Minor Elementary School, supporting students with cognitive and physical disabilities from pre-K3 to 5th grade. I'm also a resident of Ward 7, Deanwood neighborhood. Thank you for taking a moment on this Saturday morning to take part in an active conversation regarding why it is important for students, parents, teachers, and community members to have a voice in our schools. Research over the last 40 years provides educators and parents with a substantial body of evidence that parent involvement and engagement is associated with children's academic performance and social competence. Thank you for taking a moment to address and plainly state what happens when leaders do not listen to the community. For instance, earlier this year when Schools Without Walls principal was dismissed after informing his superiors that the school was not ready for in-person learning to take place in this post-COVID new normal educational landscape. Thank you again for coming and being open and honest in supporting the creation of a DC education system that responds to community voice, community power through active collaboration. On March 13, 2020, as an educator, I realized the way that I would connect and educate my students will forever be altered because of the impact of COVID-19. As a mother on this same day, I became more determined than ever to educate myself on the issues that could adversely affect my children in a virtual learning space and address them one by one. This is in fact why we invited you. Yes, you. We here at EmpowerEd believe that ending mayor control and putting in place smart reforms that give more power to community members and accountability to the officials we elect. James Baldwin said, "We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist." Lastly, COVID-19 has opened all of our eyes to see a closer view of the inadequacies of our DC educational system. We can say Black Lives Matter, but until we create an equitable DC educational system with intentional policy reforms that address the deep-rooted systematic issues facing Black and Brown students, then Black Lives Matter is just a phrase. This is why today is important, because as an EmpowerEd fellow, educator, and mother, that your active participation matters, as does mine. And I look forward to hearing from all of you as we listen to one another and work together to shape the future of DC education for all students in all wards throughout the District of Columbia. Now to our Executive Director, Scott Goldstein.
Thank you so much, Patricia, and thank you so much, everyone, for being here with us today in this really, really important event. And we're so excited to have all of you here representing so many diverse perspectives in our education system. So thank you so much for being here. If you have not yet, just a couple of reminders about what Chanel started us off with. Please take a look up at the 8 designations in the chat and rename yourself, clicking the 3 dots and then rename, with 1 student, 2 teacher or educator, 3 parent, 4 elected official, 5 policy expert or advocate, 6 principal, 7 community member, or 8 EmpowerEd fellow. So just ask you to put the number, period, and then your name as you rename yourself. And now we're gonna start by introducing our really amazing panel today. So I am gonna ask all the panelists to turn your cameras on. So hopefully they will be spotlighted here. And I will begin by introducing everyone. So, and then we'll get started. Thank you guys all so much for being here. I'm gonna start first with our council member Robert White. Thank you for being here. State Board of Education President Ruth Wattenberg. Thank you for being here. WTU President Elizabeth Davis. State Board of Education Student Representative Sullivan. Allison Criner Brown, Ward 8 parent and advocate. Ron Thompson Jr., former DCPS student and advocate, and our DCPS educator, Collin Radix Carter, who's also an EmpowerEd fellow. Welcome, everybody. So thank you guys all so much for being here. We're gonna start by just framing this discussion about community disenfranchisement in our system and how we can more empower community voices in our education system. So to start off, I just wanted to ask everybody to do a little bit of an introduction, and I will ask everybody, given the time we have, to keep it to 60 seconds, 90 if you need, to address our first question and also introduce yourself. So the question I want to start with is, how has our current system, mayoral control, impacted your ability to be heard in our education system from whatever avenue you come at this from, right? And perform your job in the best way possible. So if you're an elected official, how does it impact your ability to, hold folks accountable? If you're a student, how does it impact your ability to get the best education? So given your identity and your role in our education system, how has the current system impacted your ability to see through the best education system we can have? And so I will start us off with our student voice, Sullivan, and then we'll go to Ron.
Thank you, Scott. My name is Allison Sullivan. I'm an 11th grader at Basis DC Public Charter High School. And I'm also a student representative on the DC State Board of Education. This is my 2nd term with the State Board. And over the past couple of years, I've been able to really involve myself in our education system as a whole from the policy level, and also get more involved in local politics and figuring out our local governance structure. So one of the biggest, I'd say the most notable factors of mayoral control that's been inhibiting my ability to get real change for other students is even after this past week, the Student Advisory Committee of the State Board put together an event based around distance learning, and we got overwhelming feedback from the other students that we needed to fix the way our attendance system is working. And so that's been something that all of us for the past couple months have been pretty passionate about. So I tried to email the person who is in charge of the attendance system, or tried to get in contact with them. And it was just like, I couldn't find that person. It was impossible to deal with. The state board currently has very little power, and it's very concerning to me, because how are we going to get real change on the matter when the only publicly elected education body doesn't really hold any influence in these matters? So when we're trying to solve an issue like the way our attendance system is working, and all the students know what the issue is, it's impossible to actually figure out who to contact, because there are all of these independent or all of these agencies within the government that actually control the matter. So I think there needs to be more power directly in the hands of public bodies like the state board, because it's more accessible for students to come and voice their concerns, and also will actually be able to see the role of electing officials who will be held accountable for the work they do in our education system. So I'd say that's probably one of the ways as a student representative I've been impacted, and I'm sure you'll hear more from the other panelists as well.
Thank you so much, Alex. We're going to go to Ron as representing a former student today, and then we'll go to Allison from the parent perspective after that.
Thanks, Scott, and thank you all for EmpowerEd for hosting this conversation about something that it took me years to recognize its impact on the success of students, the ability for parents to exercise any level of control over their students' education. For me, Alex, and many of the other student representatives on the state board, you know, when I was coming up through DCPS, we didn't have that role. And really, I could say that I didn't know who to look to, save for the council and the mayor, when something was going wrong or when there was a need for improvement. In my years, I graduated from Dunbar in 2016. I began school right before Chancellor Rhee, former Chancellor Michelle Rhee, took, just around the time that she took the helm as Chancellor, and we went through this kind of governance restructuring, reorganization in the district. And so I got to see from beginning to now the exclusion of dissenting voices and really of accountability systems that are students and parents and teachers from the process that is school governance. And it left me most days frustrated that I couldn't, you know, by the time that I could really advocate for myself, that I didn't know who to turn to. And when I did turn to the people who were in positions in theory to hold the system accountability, I was being ignored. And so post-graduation, I have worked as hard as I can with as many people as I could to raise this issue that we can't do any of the necessary reforms. We can't empower students like Alex to really have a seat at the table, and that seat be meaningful, that voice be really integrated in the decision-making that goes on in DC, in our public school system. We can't have the teachers be empowered if this system continues to live on. Parents will not be empowered if this system continues to live on. Our students will continue to suffer because at the end of the day, we aren't focusing in on the success of our students. We're focusing on the success, I would say, of people, of figureheads, of adults. And so I say all that to say, I am not a fan of mayoral control. I've done everything that I can since graduating to end this system, and I'm looking forward to hearing from other folks on their views on it and how they work to end it in the district. I'll be quiet now.
Thank you so much, Ron. I will turn for the parent perspective now to Allison Cranner-Brown.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Allison Cranner-Brown. I use she and her pronouns. I'm a DCPS parent. I live in Ward 8, and my daughter attends Beers Elementary. And for the past 10 years, since 2010 up until this year, I also was a community partner supporting family engagement in DCPS schools and working with several charter schools through Teaching for Change. So I'm bringing my perspective as a parent, but I'm also bringing in many perspectives of parents that I've worked with over the years. I've worked with parents in, officially as a partner in every ward except for wards 3 and ward 7, but I'm a parent in a ward 7 school. So I have a few notes. I'm going to try to go through these quickly to answer the first question. So one, I would place this around 3 themes from the parent perspective. And I'm particularly focused, Scott, I don't know if we really are focusing just on DCPS, but that's really the perspective I can speak more so to. So when I'm talking more so about DCPS and particularly the connection between the chancellor and the mayor. And I'm not talking about the people, I'm talking about the roles. So I want to be very, very clear about that. I've been in DC and lived long enough to see a few chancellors and to see a few mayors. So to me, there are 3 big themes that come up from the parent side. So one is representation. Who represents parent interests and parent voices to the chancellor or to the mayor? What are the avenues for that? And as someone who has worked with parents in schools, it's very, very unclear for parents, as soon as the issue goes beyond the principal, and I can give you several examples that I just jotted down now: modernization, school budget, facilities and repairs, even things like recess and scheduling, principals and school leaders themselves. We had Dr. JK who was dismissed earlier this year, and now there's questions about the leadership, at Johnson Middle School. Programs that you want to see in your schools or that we want to see in DCPS. For example, expanding community schools and really doing them thoroughly. Language access. We have not invested in language access and supported our English language learners in this district the way that we should. So there are so many issues that parents see on the ground, and who is representing their voice to leadership? Is it the council? Is it we have to go to the mayor directly themselves? So it's very, very unclear, particularly for parents who do not know what the systems or structures are or where to go. And even for those who do, you're often ping-ponging. So representation, access. How do you get access to the people who are making decisions, about what's best for you and not necessarily with you? And then the third theme is really this comes down to power. By the time that parents are engaged, most often, decisions have already been made. And I can give you a very clear example of this. This isn't necessarily a bad example, but a clear example. So we now have Ida B. Wells Middle School up in Ward 4, which I know there was very, very welcome, in part because there were challenges in how you funded the pre-K through 8, the education campuses. They were funded as elementary schools. The middle school kids weren't really getting what they needed. And so I was there as a community partner when DCPS staff would come and say, we want to talk to parents about, a middle school. Should we have a middle school? What should it look like? Well, there had already been a budget line in the school budget for New North Middle School. It had been in the budget already for years. So the questions that were being asked, and a number of people were like, we already know that this decision has been made. So what are you actually asking us? Are you asking us, do we want this? Are you asking us what kind of programming do you want? Has that already been decided? And so, time and time again, these issues of representation, access, and power play out continually for parents. And a lot of times when parents do speak up, I've literally been in the room when they've been told, you don't know what you're talking about. That's not what's happening. And there have been some better efforts, but the system as a whole is not, particularly for DCPS, really is not set up to have parent voices represented, to give them access, particularly parents who do not have the time, necessarily the literacy levels, or a familiarity with the system. So I'll pause there. Also, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Allison. All right, we'll go to the teacher perspective. So we'll hear first from Collin and then WTU President Davis.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Collin Carter. I am an EmpowerEd fellow, and I'm also a pre-K teacher in Ward 3 in DCPS. Thank you, Scott, for the opportunity for me to speak today. I do want to say beforehand, I do want to preface that what I'm going to speak on is based on my thoughts as a teacher within the district who has worked in DCPS now for 3.5 years now. So these thoughts are not necessarily representative of all teachers. but I do want to express what I've been thinking about in lieu of my experience in DCPS within the last few years, in addition to my overall state status as an educator and activist within the last close to 20 years. And I want to start off, and when Scott gave us this question this week, honestly, I had a hard time really processing as to what my entire issue, like my struggle, you know, just as far as being a teacher in the district has been. And then I remembered when my last teaching position in Boston, before I moved to DCPS, I had the unique opportunity to help found a school. And one of the things that we did when we all came together as teachers with the principal at the time, we talked about what the culture of our school should be. And my principal at that time gave us this quote from Ron Berger, which I want to read to you now. The key to excellence is this: it is born from a culture. When children enter a family culture, a community culture, or a school culture that demands and supports excellence, they work to fit into that culture. A culture of excellence transcends race, class, and geography. It doesn't matter what color, income, or background the children comes from. Once those children enter a culture with a powerful ethic, that ethic becomes their norm. It's what they know. And so in thinking about that in relation to DCPS, the question that I'm asking is, who sets the culture in our community? Is it coming from the community themselves, from parents, from teachers or students, or is it coming from the top? And my issue that I think I kind of came to, you know, probably just yesterday, is the fact that right now our culture is set at the very top. And as a result, it's become a very top-down, very authoritative system where, as a teacher, I feel that if I don't do what I'm supposed to do, or if I show a minimal bit of resistance, then my job is on the line. And so there is this pressure for me to feel that I have to cross my T's and make sure I'm performing well and perform at a high standard. And it might be naive of me thinking this way, but the belief is if I work very hard and I do what I'm supposed to do, then the people at the top who are supposed to set the culture, at least in this system, would take care of me. And I feel as a teacher that really hasn't happened, you know, from the very people who are responsible for my well-being. And to be fair to within my school, I have the support of my principal, but even with my principal, there's only so much, especially right now with COVID, that she can do. And so I think when we talk about this issue of mayoral control, I'm not necessarily opposed to it per se, but I think the issue is if the mayor and the people who are kind of under her at the very top are making all of the decisions, and none of those decisions are being considered from the people on the ground who are driving this institution that is DCPS, then I think that's a problem. And I think that's an issue that has to be addressed, because as a result, teachers are feeling very stifled and silenced. And I think especially students and parents in lower income communities that have been generationally silenced for decades is becoming a huge problem. And I think those issues have to be addressed in relation to those issues, where there is more of where there's more collaboration as far as how should our system run and how can it be formed into a culture where it's more equitable in the district.
Thanks so much, Collin. And WTU President Davis, how has this system impacted your ability to advocate on behalf of all DCPS teachers?
Thank you, Scott, and good morning. I'm going to have to fold this into two roles. That is the teacher and that as president of the WTU. And I was thinking when I read your question about how I was able to navigate the system, problems, issues at my school before the 2007 PARA Act was instituted. We had the active school board. We had an elected school board member. Most of my time was spent in 3 schools in Ward 7 and 8. And I think about the ability to go before the school board each month with students and parents to talk about issues at my school. As a result of the PARA law in 2007, basically taking away the power of the school board, in many ways has stifled the voice of students, parents, and teachers. And when I think about my role now as president of the WTU and what that law was intended to do, after the council commissioned a study to determine whether or not mayoral control has actually been effective, they came out with the summative evaluation, which basically identified that mayoral control has not worked in the district. The purpose for which it was intended was to improve, and I'm going to speak to the issue of education because it talked about a lot, whether or not there was cross collaboration between agencies, the Office of the State Superintendent in DC schools. That they made it very clear in their report that that had not happened. Whether or not the executive, meaning the mayor, had actually improved collaboration between the mayor, between the unions representing school workers, and between some of the various city agencies. And they actually pointed out in the study that that had not happened. So when I think about mayoral control, and I'm not a big fan of it, I'm glad that you're having this discussion, because when I reflect on what occurred in our schools prior to 2007, prior to the para reforms, the voice of parents was absolutely, it was more authentic. Since 2007, noticing how parents have not been engaged even in the planning of how schools, more recently, how schools are reopened after COVID. Not only have parents been disengaged, but all constituents, teachers, principals, and of course, the flow of information, clear, concise information has dissipated. So one of the things that I would consider if we, and of course, if we talk about the achievement gap or the opportunity gaps, that was another reason for the para reforms to be instituted, to improve, to close the opportunity gaps that exist in DC. And since 2007, that gap has grown from 17 scale score points to 52. So that hasn't worked. So the assessment that was done by the National Research Council, and of course that was a very long report, but we need to revisit that because in that report, although it was limited in so many ways because they did not have access to data, which is still a problem. The information that they needed on teacher evaluation, not able to secure that. So the flow of information, transparency, cross-sector collaboration, none of those things have occurred under mayoral control. When I think most recently, how the chancellor selection process in the last 4 chancellor selections basically happened. The council basically gave the mayor the authority to not follow what the law said she should do. So I am not clear on whether or not, and of course there are some positives, there are some pros, but the cons are outstanding. And if there is no oversight and accountability from the council to ensure that the executive office of the mayor follows the law, it's a dead end. So I'm hoping that we will have some future discussions about what steps need to be taken to move back to where we have a school board, an elected school board that will have the authority to make decisions and that will give voice back to teachers, educators, parents, and other community stakeholders.
Thank you so much, President Davis. I'm going to move to Council Member Robert White, and then finally State Board as Ruth Wattenberg.
Thanks so much, Scott, for having me, and EmpowerEd for everything that you do. I'm at-large Council Member Robert White. I also have 2 small kids who you will probably hear in the background. And so I am, making no mistake, a parent before I'm a council member, but I council member as a parent. And that's one of the reasons I've been so involved in education. The ability to do my job under the current structure of education in our city makes it nearly impossible, but also dangerous. And here's why it's dangerous. Several of the panelists pointed out that access to the data about education is all controlled by mayoral appointees. And, all of us are kind of old enough to realize that you are never going to throw your boss under the bus. So the data is always going to show progress, even if progress isn't happening. The reason that it's so dangerous because there is mayoral control over every agency. But if our Department of Transportation fudges numbers on the number of streets that are paved, that's bad. If Department of Public Works fudges the numbers on how long it takes trash to get picked up or pick up a dead animal out of the street, that's bad. But if we're fudging numbers on education, that's criminal. That is a different thing. Because it's a different thing, it requires a different structure of government that makes checks and balances real and more defined, which is something that we don't have now. And so we see the lack of not just parental voices, but even council voices when we look at something recent like the school reopening plan. So teachers, council members, parents, we all found out that there was a school reopening plan in the mayor's press conference, and we didn't even know it was coming in the press conference. So we didn't even know to turn the thing on, right? That's a significant problem. But the council, as much as the council does need to do a better job in oversight, there is so much control in the executive that it really stymies oversight. So an example, we passed, the council before I got there passed a law to add at-risk funding because we recognize that students with significant barriers were having a much harder time. So we passed the law, we provided the funding, but that funding still years later is not getting to those students. And so this imbalance of power is so severe that it is harming children, and certainly as a parent, frustrating and harming parents because it limits what we know about what's going on in schools. It limits our ability to have a voice. I think Allison, Criner Brown put it perfectly when you mentioned access. You don't have access to the information, but you also lack power to chart the path because, and I think Allison's the one who pointed this out too, it's one of my biggest frustrations. By the time DC schools bring something to the community, they've already made the decision. And so, input is really moot at that point, and it really is insulting, but it's also defeating. Because without buy-in, without trust, we're not going to be able to move our schools forward. And the current structure of governance really stymies that trust. So this is something I've worked on from the council level. It's something I want to continue to work on. But I do want to especially thank Alex as a student voice on here for the perspective that you brought. And let me be quiet now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, Ruth.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So first of all, Scott, thanks for having this. Thanks for having me. And it's great to see all these faces here, many of whom we have actually seen at our recent State Board of Ed meetings where we've been having more and more parents, stakeholders, teachers come and talk to us about the different issues. So when it comes to how is my ability to represent people hindered by this system, let me say a few. First of all, let me just echo everything that Councilman White just said about data. One of my interests in this, I wrote an op-ed for the Post a couple of years ago called "Why the Mayor's Control of School Data Hurts Schools," and it hurts students. Sorry, and it does. I mean, one example, he gave a couple of examples. Another one was it was well-known inside sort of a well-known secret, so to speak, that teachers were being essentially forced to push kids through to graduation and not providing the services that needed to be provided. It was kind of known, but it took a scandal to break it. And that is a problem with having the mayor both, being in charge of the DCPS schools and being in charge of OSSI. And to the councilman's point, that just can't be. We need data. A couple of other examples, and I'm just going to pick up on also something that Allison said about her community learning about a school being proposed after it was already happening. That happened here in Ward 3. We, as people know, I think, we have terrible problems. We need more buildings. People want more buildings. But last spring, a new building was plopped into the budget for a new school building. Nobody had known about it. Nobody knew where it was going to go. Nobody knew who it was going to serve. So it's like, is this the right way to run things? No, of course it is not. The other thing I just want to say is what part of what we would know if we or an elected board or somebody had a regular conversation with parents, with stakeholders. One of the things we would know and could act on would be what turns out to be an extraordinary lack of trust. And I just want to go back to a meeting that we had, I think it was in July, at the State Board of Education. I think this was the one where maybe 50 or 60 folks came to testify before us. And what struck, I think, everybody on the board was the extent to which stakeholders did not have faith in what was going to be proposed. They didn't trust it to be safe. And I say that because if the people who were running things had those conversations regularly with people and cared what people were thinking, that would have been the first thing they would have dealt with. Coming out of that meeting, I thought, man, if we want to rebuild trust, which we need to do, one of the first things I would do, I would pile up the PPP in every school, because every parent, every teacher knows that soap doesn't get refilled, toilet paper doesn't get refilled. We can go down the list. You hear it all the time. So telling people, oh, the PPP will be there, that doesn't do it. My first thing would have been, show them, have a stockload of PPE in those closets when parents came in. And I could go on with various ways we could have built that trust. And if we did, we wouldn't be in this position. And that's why having the responsiveness and the ability to hear and respond is so important to our kids, because it affects their education.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We're going to go to some open-ended questions now. And before we do, I'm going to share a brief image, because we cannot talk about our education governance system without also talking about race. And I want to look at this image, which shows takeovers of school districts from, let's see, I should be able to see it in here in a second, from I think it's 1989 to, there we go, 1989 to 2013. And I want you to look at the difference between what happens when takeovers are enacted between majority white districts, majority Latino districts, and majority Black districts. And it's really stunning. So it is almost never, right, that in a majority white district, a school board is abolished, right? But in majority Latino districts, and especially majority Black districts, it happens all the time. So why is it, right? And I think there's some really, our teacher fellows have been digging into some data, doing a lot of reading on mayoral control and other education governance systems. I'd really love the panel to respond, because when you do the research into it, it becomes very clear and very striking, right? That the belief that democracy can't work, that a community-led system can't work, seems to only be true when you're talking about majority Black and brown districts. But when it's majority white districts, we don't see the state coming in and saying, you can't elect people, right? We can't have democracy here. So I'd love the council, anybody who wants to respond, I'll throw out the question, how does our current system disproportionately impact the voices of communities of color, Black or Latino, and students, teachers, parents, community members in our city? And what reforms might empower, elevate the voices of communities of color? So I'll throw that open to anyone who wants to jump in. And as someone's speaking, the other panelists feel free to use the raise hand feature to jump in next.
I'll start, Scott. One of the things I noted as a teacher in Wards 7 and 8, and I always make comparisons of how parents are treated in particular wards of the city based on their race and power and privilege. What I noted in the schools in Ward 8, it was not a lack of parent engagement, but it was a lack of interest in hearing from parents of students who were poor. And what I've noted is in communities where there's little parent advocacy, those communities are usually run over. They're usually taken over. Decisions are made for the parent. When I look at how charters have proliferated in Ward 7 and 8, but when you look west of the park, you see very few or no charter schools in certain wards. So, and I notice in communities where there is a lack of parent voice and where parents are basically stripped of their voice even further, the decisions are made by others. So it's not unusual to see that this is a trend that actually happens in cities that have a majority of white citizens.
Thank you. Allison.
Yeah, so to that chart and it seems, and when we look at trends, I believe Childish Gambino said it best when he said, this is America. Okay, racism and classism have systemic features. And so that also plays out in education. And one of the ways that directly plays out is who has the time, who has the energy, who has the clout, and the political power, quite frankly, to move things and to make things happen. You know, in doing the work that I did organizing with parents for 10 years, one of the things that I saw very consistently is when a question came up, everybody would just look around the table and say, well, do you know who we call, or do you know where? And it was like, you know, well, we don't know. And I was very fortunate to, you know, I know a lot more about modernizations and school budgeting and a lot of these things only because it took asking 500 questions and going to one person who says, you need to ask this. And then there's this office and this agency, and, you know, and there are a lot of moving pieces. And I think that one thing that people should take right now, I think that a lot of folks, I hope, are taking as a lesson right now, during the pandemic, everyone feels overwhelmed in a lot of different ways, between the pandemic and between what's going on for racial justice issues in this country. A lot of people are really expressing feeling overwhelmed. Parents already feel overwhelmed a lot on a regular basis. And if you are one of the parents who is dealing with the brunt of systemic racism and classism, who's trying to figure out how are you going to deal with, you know, housing issues, how are you going to, you know, you're taking public transportation, which takes hours out of people's days. If you're trying to figure out how to navigate, I'm in Ward 8, we have a food desert here. We still have only one full service grocery store for the whole ward. There are so many challenges that parents are navigating on the day-to-day just to make sure their kids show up and are ready to learn. And so the system does not meet them where they are at. The system says you have to have the time and the wherewithal and the knowledge to figure out and navigate all of this, and to be able to go. I have been in meetings at schools where we're going around and, you know, it's parent, parent, parent. I'm from the council member's office. I'm from the mayor's office. And that has only happened on one side of the Anacostia River, and I bet you can guess which one. Okay, so the burden of figuring out this quagmire of a system is placed on parents. And so to Black and brown parents, that automatically puts them at a disadvantage. And as I said, I know a lot more about this because I was essentially able to use my paid time on the job to start to figure this out. And then it still requires help. It's still not automatic in being able to get things done. So again, going back to the earlier themes that I brought up too, of representation, access, and power, if the system really wanted to be equitable, we would have to build it in to meet parents where they are at. But in a lot of ways, it feels very intentionally, you know, misleading, and you don't know where to go. So there's a piece of access that needs to come in. And the last comment I'll make quickly is I spoke to someone who was on the school board before the act, and she's actually on this call now, who's on the school board for a number of years. And I shared the questions with her in advance, Scott, and we talked through a number of these. And on the question of how are, you know, Black and brown parents in particular disadvantaged by the system, it's not a one-to-one of how things used to be and how they are. It's you know, we can't just do before and after. It's not apples to apples comparison. But one thing that she was able to pull out was that when you had the elected school board members, they were getting out to the buildings. They were able to go out to schools, sit in PTA and PTO meetings, to go and meet parents. When there were issues in the building, they could go take a tour with the DCPS and the DGS staff person. And so one of the things that would be really important is to have more people who are actually able to go out and engage and then bring these issues back to work on them, who have the power and authority to work on these issues. But just saying we have a meeting and parents from here didn't show up is not at all representative of what people care about.
Thanks, Allison. So I saw Collin and then Alex and Ron. So I'll ask everyone to be brief so we can get everybody in. Go ahead, Collin.
Thanks, Scott. So I think to echo what Allison was saying, I think for me as a teacher, one way I see this perpetuated, and this is something I have been thinking about for years, is our curriculum. And being in Ward 3, and being at my particular school, I have the privilege, and I understand the privilege that I have. In my classroom, I do a project-based learning model, which is empowered by the students. I don't teach anything that my students don't tell me what is not important to them. And even just a simple example as yesterday, I had a project, I had an assignment that I wanted them to do in small groups. I had my own way of thinking of it, and then the children came to me and said, we don't want to necessarily do this way. Can we do it in our way? And I gave them the opportunity to do that. And 20 minutes, but those 20 minutes was probably the most peaceful and probably the most pleasant time that I probably remember, teaching virtually probably in the last month, to be quite honest. And so when I think about curriculum, again, I have to go back to the question of who sets the culture. And for me as a teacher, I am empowering my students to set the culture for themselves as to helping them understand that you have enough experience, and yes, you're 4 and 5 years old, as to you have enough experience to tell me as your teacher, as your facilitator, what is important to you. And so in connection to curriculum, I have to wonder, I'm very privileged to have that kind of relationship with families. I'm able to do that in my ward and at my school. Are these conversations happening east of Anacostia? Are those families engaged? Are those students engaged? Are we asking families, what is important to you? Are we asking students, what is important to you? What drives you? And so again, I have to bring it back to culture. Who is setting the culture in DCPS? Is it coming from the families? Is it coming from the students? Or is it coming from a select few who have a very narrow idea of what they want from students and families that may not resonate with families, especially families of color, who I think we need to invest in more to figure out what do they value, what drives them, so that teachers can be responsible and schools can be responsible to really tailor their curriculum around their needs. And I don't think that's happening. And I think, again, when you have this top-down mentality of we know best, then it's going to be a huge problem.
Thank you. We'll go quickly to Alex, Ron, and then Ruth.
Thank you, Scott. So there are a couple of things. One of them just being the inequitable access to funding and inequitable access to opportunities, especially for schools and students that are east of the Anacostia River. And also just listening to what Councilmember White was saying about the reopen decision a couple months ago with the mayor and the chancellor, and watching that press conference. I remember sitting here doing my work, watching to see what was going to happen. And it really felt like it was almost like a television scene or something. The council member didn't even know what the plan was. So to think that a student, that families, parents could be engaged, that just seems so asinine. And honestly, it's very indicative of our education system as a whole, because the fact is these meetings are happening behind closed doors and no one's really engaged. At our state board meetings, like Ruth was saying, we had like 50, 60, I want to say, public comments, people that came in to talk about SROs and the reopening committee. And it almost feels like at times that there's nothing we can do, because no matter how many people come to our state board meetings, there's only so much stuff that can happen. And even when we do get to ask the chancellor questions or ask the deputy mayor of education questions, you can see how they want to sidestep, how they're trying to avoid the real issues. So for me, like even the fact that the state board wasn't invited to any of the reopen schools education committees, even though we're the only publicly elected education body in the city, that's indicative of our education system as a whole. Additionally, we need more charter transparency, as was put in the chat, because I attend a charter school and we've had 5 different principals in the past 7 years that I've been at my middle school / high school, and none of them have been Black. So we need to look at in our schools what the hiring, firing, and promotion processes are looking like, because that all matters to the students and to the school culture. And additionally, I'd say the star rating, the star impact system, star rating system that's in place, because it's just so crazy to me that we're rating schools from 1 to 5, because that means we're rating students and teachers as well from 1 to 5. And that doesn't make any sense for what we're trying to accomplish in a school building. So overall, I think we need a change to the way our system works, because the way it's working currently, it doesn't engage parents and students. And when it does not matter what we have to say, because as Allison was pretty much saying, the decisions are already being made. And that's what it felt like from a student's perspective. So there is actually no way for us to have insight and then actually see it affects real change. So I'd say overall, what's happening right now doesn't work, because even if we want change, even if we want to hold our leaders accountable, we can't vote for the chancellor. we can't vote for the superintendent of OSSI. Like, we can't do that. We can only vote for the mayor, and it's extremely difficult to take the mayor out of power, especially in a city like this where there aren't that many challengers frequently. So we need to actually have real change that it doesn't just rely on who the next mayor is, but that we can have at least 9 people on a public education body who make these decisions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Alex, for lifting all that up. I'm going to go to Ron and then Ruth, if you can try to stick to about a minute each, and then we'll go to our final question.
Yeah, I'm going to try to stick to a minute. I think for me, when you look at that data and you look at the fact that the majority Black school districts have had democracy stripped from those communities. I think to Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery, and throughout that book, despite kind of all, I mean, not, and throughout his autobiography, he talks about the importance of the vote to the Black community. He talks about that through the entirety of his autobiography. The denial of democracy for Black communities is intentional, right? When states have stripped local school boards of their power, and in these cases of, you know, you see it that it is very intentional that people are taking power away from Black communities. DC is unique in that we've had both Congress and local government strip the majority Black school district of authority of its, you know, from the Black parents, the Black students. They stripped that power away. So first it was Congress in 96, 97, and then it was the council in 2007. And someone in the chat made a really good point, because it's not just about, in the local context, it's not just about race. Race plays a very important factor in, but it's also about class, because as someone pointed out, I can remember being at a town hall with the newly appointed Chancellor Kaya Henderson. And when the parents in Ward 8, to be honest, we know who we are. I'm a Ward 8 native. My mom family grew up in Ward 8. We are majority Black, very, very impoverished ward, the most impoverished, the most Black ward in the city. When parents got up to speak their concerns at this town hall, the people who were alongside the chancellor were like, well, we didn't expect this to be what it was, but we have grievances. And if these are the only forums that you provide for parents and students to come up and speak, this is what you're going to get. If you've been to any public meeting in Ward 8, you know that that's how it goes, because people are saying, we never hear from you. And that is the truth. We have got to confront as a city these two realities as it pertains to public education. And this system replicates itself. When you look at the criminal justice system in the District of Columbia, we do not have a say-so on the person who prosecutes crimes in the District of Columbia. It is a unique feature in the United States. When it comes to Congress being able to imply, for example, and then I'll hush up, there is the Landrieu rule, right? The Landrieu Amendment, which if you said it, you'd be like, okay, maybe this was like just something that's in DC code. The Landrieu Amendment, which gives charters the ability to first right to public buildings, public schools, when they're disposed of, may not be the word, but when they're removed from the district's inventory, that does not come from local law. Mary Landrieu, a white woman from Louisiana, a former senator, put that into an omnibus budget. We had no say. Our elected Congress person, Eleanor Holmes Norton, was opposed to it, and yet it is the law of the District of Columbia. When you look at our system, it is designed to advantage a small group of people over the majority of Black, largely at-risk, low-income students that go and attend DC public schools in both sectors. And until people really reckon with, is this the sort of city that we want to run and operate, then we're going to have that massive, I don't even want to call it achievement gap. I like President Davis, the opportunity gap. We are going to continue and continue and continue to see Black children fail and their non-Black peers succeed. That's what we are reckoning with right now. Is democracy for Black poor people, or is it just for those who can afford it and don't look like me and don't come from Ward 8 and Ward 7? That's the question.
Thank you, Ron. That was powerful. And thank you for bringing in all the history, because we have to understand that history to understand why we have this system and who built this system, right? That disenfranchises these voices. So I'm going to go to the last question and start with Ruth, because I know you wanted to get in on that question, but I'm going to also pack in the next part of the question for you, as we have about 10 minutes left in our panel. So we're going to get to the solutions now. We've heard the history. We've heard about why we have this system. We've heard about how it disproportionately impacts communities of color and the disenfranchisement of community voices, especially from communities of color, and the stakeholders who are really on the ground. And we've seen so much of that, an illustration of that this year, right, in how this plays out during the pandemic and our questions about return to school. But what specific reforms, I'm going to go to the elected officials first on this. I'll start with Ruth and then Councilmember White. What specific reforms to our education governance system? You know, when folks say end mayoral control, well, replace it with what, right? So this is about specific reforms that we'd like to see. Is it more accountability? Is it more checks and balances, more transparency? Is it folks we elect having specific powers? So what are those specific reforms that would embolden, empower Black and brown voices, students, teachers, parents, community members, those closest to our education system? So I'll start with Ruth, and then I'll go to Councilmember White, and if anybody else wants to jump in. You're on mute there. I think your phone is on mute. See if we can get that off. Can't hear still.
She's still on mute, Scott.
Yeah, let me see. If we can unmute it. Let's see. Try again. There you go.
Got it? All right.
Yep.
Sorry, guys. Alex knows this is a regular thing for me. I'm sorry. But what I said is yes, yes, yes to everything that Scott said about what we need to change. I mean, we need data, we need authority, and so on. But I want to say a few very specific things. Going back to the chart where you showed the majority white versus majority Black and brown districts and whether or not they had elected boards. What that chart didn't say, but it's really important to know, is even of the in those districts where the school boards were abolished, even in the districts that are mayoral control, we are the only one, I think, or one of a tiny, tiny number that have no board at all. In some cases, the boards are appointed by other groups. They might be appointed by stakeholders. They might be appointed by the mayor. Those are not perfect, but part of what it provides, and this is critical, is it means, as I think Liz said at one point and Ron said, there is a regular meeting every 2 weeks that's public, and people come there and they say what's on their mind and they talk about the issues, and that makes a big difference. So that's a small thing, but it's really, really important that the policies of the chancellor in this case would have to be made public and have to come to a public forum on a regular basis. Second, that if we ask for data, if the council asks, you could have lots of other groups, that data needs to be forthcoming. We ask for things, we can't get it. The council asks for things, they can't get it. What is going on with students under IEPs in the pandemic? How many kids really have devices? We still don't really know. What are the scores on our different tests of students who are not just at risk, but in the lowest income portions of that risk? Students who are on TANF, students who are homeless. We don't know. We asked OSSI to provide this data several years ago in one of the few unanimous votes of the state board, and we still don't have it. So those are a couple of things, and I do want to give some momentum to a bill that Mary Chey put in a few years ago that wouldn't have dealt with the mayoral control piece of DCPS directly, but it would have put OSSI under the State Board of Ed. So you'd have an elected set of officers, elected set of officials who at least could do oversight, who were in charge of the data, who were in a position to regulate certain things that were of greatest consequence. So I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Yeah, thank you for those specifics. Okay, Councilmember White.
Thank you. So the key issue is checks and balances. And let me acknowledge my colleague from Ward 6, Charles Allen, my soon-to-be colleague from Ward 4, Janice Lewis George. Councilmember Allen has been, as many of you know, strongly involved in education. Like me, he's the DCPS parent. But what really is required is checks and balances, you know, and so many of us know that the current structure of education leads to a lack of data, lack of implementation of council laws that folks don't want to implement. And so we have to look at what levers give us the most control over the things that are preventing progress in our school. So I do think that we have to empower our State Board of Education, and we have to have a discussion about exactly what that looks like, but we have to know that we have to do that as a matter of accountability. They are the closest to the parents and the students that are directly impacted by our schools. We also have to look at an independent state superintendent of education, because we cannot have everybody with access to the data reporting to and accountable to the mayor, or we cannot expect to get the type of kind of clear, honest answers that we want to hear. As I mentioned earlier, you're never going to hear the state superintendent of education, the chancellor, the deputy mayor for education come to a public hearing and criticize the mayor or say that something isn't going right. Under our current structure, you're never going to have that. But the biggest thing that I think we have to do is to have an honest conversation about where we're going. And that's been the most frustrating thing over the past 4 years about being on the council, is that I've spent 4 years having a debate about whether or not everything we're doing right now is not working, which to me is as clear as day. But we're wasting time arguing about whether we are on the perfect track instead of working together to figure out how to fix what we have. So I don't find any need to cast blame or aspersions on the folks who put us on the path of mayoral control. Certainly there were issues within our school, but more than a decade in, if you look at the data now, and the data is really is clear in indications we have, students of color are not performing well. Only about a quarter of Black students are testing even on grade level now. And the achievement gap, as Liz Davis pointed out, has actually grown. So how do we look kids and parents in the eyes and say, yeah, we're going down the right track and we don't need to fix anything? And so the biggest thing I want is a policy conversation about what's not going well so that we can work together to fix it. And I always tell the administration and everybody else, consider me a partner in that discussion, but we got to have that discussion.
Appreciate that so much. And the specifics, right, about this isn't necessarily, we're going to have a complete overhaul. We're going to go back to what we had before. Sometimes we get stuck in that dichotomy instead of getting specific, right, about what reforms do we need to improve what's not working right now. And so I'll give time for one other panelist if someone wants to jump in on that final question. Allison, go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to try to go quick to see if maybe somebody else can jump in too. But I'll say, really, as a parent, accountability. How do we have the deputy mayor, the OSSI director, the chancellor, all report to the mayor? And as someone who has been in a number of parent and community meetings across school communities, and at the district level, what I have seen repeated, particularly in recent years, is from chancellors, and I say this multiple chancellors, it feels like they don't see themselves as accountable to us as parents, the public, and community. That accountability only goes up to the top. And I think Alex said it so well before when he's saying, if we can't try to put more voice in particularly DCPS education by saying we need a new mayor. That makes absolutely no sense. There's no reason that the council chair, Phil Mendelson, should have to come to my daughter's school because we're trying to figure out how do we get sprinklers in our school when we had a fire last year, and then we find out that when our school was modernized, they were told we were grandfathered and didn't need sprinklers. Why is the council chair having to come and help us figure these issues out? So there absolutely needs to be changes in accountability and the structure. And I'll just say just one last quick thing. Parents care. Parents care, point blank. Because people don't have the time to come to your meeting does not mean that they do not care. And our parents and students who are facing some of the hardest challenges, we need to restructure for them. But I have not yet met a parent who could not talk to you about what a quality education looks like for their child and for other children. And that is the way that we really need to operate. Parents want the best for their children, for their kids' peers, and for the people who are caring for and guiding them. And I'm gonna also use my last thing of airtime to just say thank you to all the teachers, especially through distance learning. We know that this is tough, and we want you all to be supported because you are the ones who are caring and guiding for our children and teaching them things that we are not prepared to do that. We need a system that really supports and enables that to happen.
Scott, can I?
Scott, this is Liz, and I just want to say that before, because I'm going to have to get off. We have an e-board meeting going on, and I can't talk about going forward until I look backwards. So I'm glad that Ron shared that history about Mary Landrieu, because I do know that there are some connections between what's happening right now under mayoral control, some correlation between mayoral control and privatization. I'm looking at one of the things, I'm just going to say, one of the things is that we need greater participation in making decisions, informed decisions, access to data, including parents and other stakeholders in the decision making, and restoring the full authority of the school board. But the privatization issue cannot be ignored because it is driving curriculum. It is driving what our kids are learning. Basically, what we've evolved to is a curriculum of compliance, where students are not receiving a well-rounded education in certain parts of the city, and in others they have access to all. But privatization is an issue. The proliferation of charters, we cannot ignore that because it is basically disrupting feeder patterns in communities in certain parts of the city. And it is having a tremendous impact on funding for schools that are underfunded. And of course, we cannot ignore that there needs to be some more attention paid to whether or not we need to allow charters to continue to grow when we, in essence, do not need those seats, and how it is the effect that it's having on the public school system, the matter of right public schools, which in some of our wards, parents do not have access to healthy feeder patterns because of the proliferation of charters, which started with the beginning of privatization, charters, and vouchers in our school district.
Thank you. I want to make sure we have full time for breakout. So 30 seconds, Ron, and I know some panelists have to go. So 30 seconds, and then we'll go to our next portion.
Very quick. One thing that I think is it's a very specific change, but it is not a government, it's not a law, it's not a change that happens in law. I have watched in my 22 years on this earth, people denigrate Black people, low-income people, in ways that are microaggressive that you wouldn't know unless you really heard and paid attention. We had an outgoing council member essentially say that people would not understand data around teacher retention, and that is why that data should not have been accessible outside of FOIA. That's something that members of council who are anti-racist or pro-equity need to speak up and say, that's some BS, to be quite frank. Because people understand, they are experiencing teacher loss. They're experiencing these things that the folks that are asking for this data, they understand. And when we allow language like that to happen, we allow the further disenfranchisement of Black, brown, low-income families in the system. We have got to speak up when people say things that are wrong, that are morally reprehensible, and that are racist and elitist. That's not a legislative fix. That's the thing that has to come from individuals taking their elected office and speaking up. I cannot speak to how many times I felt like, wow, this is how you feel about communities in this city. And that has to be fixed.
Thank you, Ron. And thank you all. That was an amazing panel. Thank you to all of you for joining us and speaking with your authentic voice, with your experiences, and inspiring us to start this conversation. We're going to move on from the panel now, and I want to acknowledge, just before we do, all of the folks who have come, our elected officials, Councilmember White, Councilmember Allen, Councilmember-elect Lewis George, Councilmember Silverman, I know, is about to come in for these breakouts in a minute, as well as our State Board of Education members, Alex, President Wattenberg, Fraser O'Leary, Emily Casoy, Zachary Parker, Jessica Sutter, and our State Board elect members, Carleen Reed and Ebony Rose Thompson, who are here. Thank you all for being here. And we have a great student presence, so I'm really excited about that. As we go into these groups, we'll have 45 minutes now for you to dive in deep, led by a teacher leader in each group. And our goal is that each group will have about 7 or 8 people, and you will have a student, hopefully a student, a teacher, an elected official, a community member, a parent in each group, right? So you'll have a diverse set of stakeholders. The teacher leader will guide you through a set of questions for you all to help us envision what is a more community-driven approach than what we have now, and how do we make sure those voices are at the center of our education system. So I'm really excited to go into these breakouts. We're gonna come back just after 12 o'clock to do a quick report out, talk about what our next steps are, and begin this process of forming a more community-driven vision, right, of what an education system that really empowers and respects our students, teachers, parents, or community members would look like. So appreciate all your participation. Everyone can go ahead and turn video on if you're ready to do that. And then you're gonna head into breakout groups now.
Some people don't have, haven't been assigned quite yet. I just need to know your affiliation. I'm gonna put the numbers back in the chat. If you just, so I know, like, you don't have to rename yourself, but if you can just let me know your affiliation, then I can assign you to an appropriate breakout room, and make sure you get to the right place. Everyone else, if you have a number in front of your name, you should have been assigned, and you should see your breakout room already. All right, let me. So if you want to just write in the chat the affiliation, and I will give you a breakout room. Super easy. Thank you. I already have a few. Thank you. All right. Thank you. Working on that right now. Oh, it's okay if you don't see the number. If you just put like your I'll just put it in there for you. For the parent. And thank you for your patience. I greatly appreciate it. Okay, some names are not showing up, and that's a problem. Yes, I'm working on it right now. Emily, I'm popping people back into places. Trying to make sure they're about even. Okay. So this is, okay, very strange. Everyone who's in here, outside of maybe Mark, should be assigned. If you look at the bottom of the, if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, around where it says participation, usually there's a spot that says join breakout room. You may have to click on the participate thing. And I'm gonna see if I can just push people, if not.
How many are in each group?
Was that, I'm sorry, who was that? Sorry, I know who that was.
That was me, Frazier.
Yeah, you've been assigned to a group. It should have popped up. I'm gonna see if I can just push you in and see what happens. But it should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen.
I'm in a group, I guess, but I just wondered how many people were in a group.
Oh, about 7 or 8.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
you're not in the group yet. You have to accept the invite to go into it.
Same with Melody and Janice. You have to accept the group.
You can send me where you want me to go, although I'm gonna start getting lunch together for the kids, so I'm mostly gonna be listening.
Okay, that's fine. I'll make that work. Assign you to go. So everybody who's in here should have been assigned. I'm not seeing anyone else pop up as unassigned outside of you, Scott. And I'm looking to see if I can just push them in. But I'm not actually sure that I can.
Chanel, I'm going to jump between rooms to record. So maybe switch me back to host if we can do that. And then...
if I switch you back to host, it's going to close the rooms.
Oh,
but
really?
you should be able to, yeah, you should be able to jump through even as co-host.
Really? I don't see like the breakout rooms.
At the bottom where it says breakout rooms, if that pops up, it should let.
I don't have breakout rooms at the bottom.
Oh, really?
You can put me in one for now.
Okay.
And I'll just message you if you want to change.
Okay, and I can, yeah, just message me and I'll just move it from place to place, I guess.
Cool.
So how we can have a more inclusive system, and to also let folks know this isn't a DCPS charter issue. This is a systematic issue. And there are many families that are caught in the middle, and oftentimes that perspective is not there. And my daughter has special needs, so she's a child with a disability. So when we talk about ending mayoral control has nothing to do with federal law and IDEA. And we have a big problem with special education here in DC, especially east of the river. And so I just have to bring that perspective everywhere I go. So just happy to be here. I'm gonna pass it to Khadijah, Rocket Ship family.
What's up? Hi, so I'm Khadijah. I'm a senior education organizer at Rocket Ship, where my role is to train parents to be effective advocates, and also to just make sure that people know that parents are superheroes. And I am here, I think I may have forgotten the question, but I'm here because I want to, hear what people are saying, kind of think of different ways to kind of engage my families, and also just basically do my job and support parents. And I will pass it off. Ruth is actually in 2 different rooms, and so I was gonna flag that for somebody. But I will, so she can't talk on this room, but I'll pass it to Mark. Oh, you're on. Oh.
Hi, everyone.
Working on it.
My name is Mark Simon, and I'm actually on the board of EmpowerEd, but I'm a former high school teacher in Montgomery County, and longtime DCPS parent. But my daughter graduated in 2012, so now I'm a community person, having worn those 2 other hats. I'm here because I think EmpowerEd really hit the nub of the most important question right now, which is how do we shift to structural greater voice for parents, teachers, students, because the time is now. It's just transparent. I'm blown away by how great this meeting has been. I think people have been incredibly articulate and in unison. So I'm very excited. That's it. And I'll pass it. I don't know who hasn't spoken yet because I came on a little bit late to the breakout. Alex, have you spoken?
Yeah, I've spoken.
Okay, has anybody not spoken?
I'll jump in.
Ruth.
Hi, everyone. My name is Noelle Amelius. I'm super excited to see such a diverse group of stakeholders. I'm a high school teacher at Columbia Heights Education Campus in Ward 1. I am currently getting a doctorate in urban education and have studied the governance structures of many different schools across the country, and am really interested in looking at DC for obvious reasons. I know Ms. Johnson-Law said that she's here and a strong special education advocate because we're not doing it right in DC, and I am writing my dissertation and researching on the English language learners in DC. So I am a fierce advocate for our EL population.
So trying to get an IEP. I have two cousins that have one with some intellectual disabilities and another with his brother with intellectual and physical disabilities. And I will say that, you know, in all of our cases, not just on those issues, but you really see when it comes to students with disabilities, the lack of I can't even think of the word, but the lack of, right? The lack of parent voice, the lack of real engagement from people within the system. Both of my cousins ended up attending. Now one attended Kingsbury, which is now closed, and the other is finishing up at St. Coletta. And it says a lot about DCPS that for just one side, that, you know, the recourse for dealing with students with disabilities is to push them out and to send them to schools that are and basically, you know, subsidize private schools or send them on to charter schools in order for those students to get access to resources. The other part is, as I think I've already mentioned, is just as a native of Ward 8, as a Black person, as somebody who, you know, has faced economic hardship, I think that there's a level of disdain for Black people, but particularly low-income Black people in this city, that leaders of all races haven't really confronted or are either fine with. There's too often this notion that we don't know better, and we are the folks who know government probably and its pitfalls better than anybody. From, you know, the Department of Human Services to DCPS to all sorts of agencies. We know what isn't going well, and no one seems to want to listen to us. So our current predicament, you know, disadvantages a lot of marginalized groups, but it is really doing a disservice to our Black low-income families.
I'll try to follow that, Ron. I just echo a lot of what Ron just said. My answer would be no as well in terms of do folks feel empowered. The one caveat I might add to that is, as a parent, I do feel empowered to speak to my kids' teachers. I feel like I've got responsive teachers that really try their damnedest to figure out, you know, how to help solve a problem, things like that. So that I do feel I have an empowered relationship with my teacher. Pretty decent with my principal, again, with my parent hat on. And then after that, it really starts to fall off, right? And Ron, you were saying this in the panel, and I think this is spot on, because it kind of gets to the heart of what does empowerment mean? Empowerment doesn't mean that people are going to agree with you every single time, right? But empowerment does mean that there is an open, honest dialogue and empathy and hearing that takes place. And that does not exist, period. Ron, I remember you were giving the example in the panel about, folks coming into Ward 8 and kind of feeling like, oh, wow, I just walked into a hornet's nest of a meeting and I'm getting yelled at. And what would you expect if you don't show up? So people bring those grievances. I've seen that play out with DCPS in particular. With my parent and ward hat on, when there was a leadership change at a school that was abrupt. DCPS didn't want to come talk to the school community who was fighting for their principal that they really wanted to protect. And then when they finally did show up, they got yelled at by 150 people until they just walked out of the room. And they shut down. And it did incredible damage to the whole school by acting that way. From my policymaker seat, I do not feel that even I am empowered to get answers out of DCPS. I ask questions in a phone call, trying to say, okay, let me just see if we can, let's take the camera and lights off for a second. Let me just see if I can pick up the phone and talk to you. I don't get answers. We go in a hearing, you don't get answers. And that's it. I mean, I almost think that we really need to get rid of the title of chancellor. They're an agency director. I can't remember who it was in the panel that talked about this. It's not like the chancellor is independent from the mayor and somehow would ever be critical of the mayor or second guess a decision or even come into conflict anyway. They work on behalf of the mayor, the same way the DPR director or any other agency works for the mayor. So there is no level of accountability or empowerment beyond that. So I think there's a lot of work that can happen. And again, my principle around empowerment isn't that you are going to agree with every decision I make, for example. But I am a firm believer that people can hear you say no when you've actually sat down, you've had a conversation, you hear each other, respect each other, and you can look each other in the eye and then say, I hear you, I'm going to go in a different direction and you can hold me accountable for that, but this is what I'm going to do. And that empowerment just doesn't exist right now.
So I want to sort of ask a question in response to that question. As a board member, we hear from lots and lots of community members. Ruth Wattenberg pointed out on the panel that we had 60 witnesses at one of our hearings, but during this whole COVID period with reopening, our public comment went from having 1 to 2 people per meeting to having lists of 20 plus at almost every meeting. So I hear from people who do not feel empowered every month at our public meetings. What I'm curious about is sort of what would make folks feel empowered using the definition that Councilmember Allen just gave. Because I grew up in Howard County, Maryland. I'm watching their school board deal with this pandemic through the eyes of my parents and their neighbors. And I'm hearing from their neighbors that they do not feel like the school board is listening to them. But these are the folks they elected who are making decisions about reopening. And they're not feeling like that structure is empowering them using the definition Charles just gave, which is they don't feel heard, even though there is an outlet that has authority to be heard. I'm hearing similar things from friends and neighbors from college up in Baltimore City. They have a board. Their board is complicated, but they do have a board, and they're having the same sort of feelings during reopening. So what kind of structures or what kind of
ensuring that we fully serve our children with the greatest needs. And the second is ensuring that we provide every community in every corner of the city an excellent matter of rights system that gives them the social good that is enjoyed in some parts of the city.
Thank you.
I think it's very important that the system communicates to the people who they work for, because there's been a total lack of communication from the leadership about what's going on during this virus, and especially about the technology gap that exists in the school systems, which is unbelievably big.
Thank you both. What else comes to mind for other?
I'll jump in. I'm Will Perkins. I work at the DC Auditor. I used to work at the other Chavez campus in Capitol Hill. For me, it feels like the city needs to work with families and with teachers and with anybody else involved. I think right now there's some idea that basically the best way to achieve results for students is to wall off the world from the decision-making process, and I just don't think that's going to work. So, thanks.
All right. Any last words before I move us ahead to our next question? All right. So thank you for the people also putting some answers in the chat. So question number 3 reads, when you and community members of the community, and at whatever role, students, teachers, parents, or community members, raise concerns about something, do you feel like the education leaders listen? If not, why? But I think let's focus here on what are the blocks and obstacles, and trying to define that as a group.
No, they don't listen, and the obstacles are they don't have to listen. Since it's a top-down, the mayor appoints the leaders, and the leaders have to answer to the mayor. Someone said in the big group about, that they don't feel like they can. It's like Trump's cabinet meeting, if you can imagine that there ever was one, where nobody's going to say anything because they're afraid they're going to lose their jobs. I have to cut out for about 40 minutes. So I hate to leave on a downer like that, but I really appreciate everything that's gone on so far.
Yeah, and thank you for being able to join us.
Sure.
I just want to second exactly what Fraser just said. And the reason I think that people are fearful that they'll.
I think this conversation today is reflective of that. But also this year, the council took up a piece of legislation that the state board introduced, which is, I believe, the first time that's ever happened, which was around the teacher retention data and collecting that. And so that, in an environment where the state board is often ignored or disregarded, felt very empowering to have those allies on the council that was putting forth that legislation.
Thank you for that. So thank you for all those great responses. Kind of moving on to a very general question. We've talked a little bit about tweaking the LSAT, and Zachary just spoke to being able to ask for info and introduce legislation specific changes, but now kind of like backing out to a broader question, what values do you want to see reflected in decision making in our education system? So we kind of got in the nuts and bolts a little before I meant to in the agenda, but taking that broader view, what are those values that you want to see reflected in decision making?
So I'm happy to go first. I mean, one that's important to me is equity in sort of and seeking parent engagement. I mean, you heard Allison, Criner, Brown say it several times, right? They set up these processes, and then the parents who are, for a variety of reasons, unable to participate at the level they may want, aren't participating.
Hi, all. Sorry, thanks for coming in. We are in breakout rooms now, so I'm going to send you all to a breakout room if I can. Good morning. Give us 1 second. I got to get the host to do our breakout room, so give me just 1 second.
No problem.
All right, host is coming back right now.
Hi, working on getting you in a breakout room right now. Let me see which one makes the most sense.
Thank you. Good morning. Excuse me.
As well, those values that we should care about those different perspectives and those different aspects that people have when it comes to these situations. Parents care about their children. Teachers care about their students. Students care about their education.
I'm able to talk to the Board of Education rep for my ward, and have been able to work with and collaborate with extensively with him. But again, that's not the person who had or he doesn't have as much power as he could or should as a member of an unelected board. So there is this kind of inverse relationship of access and power. The people with the least power are the most accessible. People with the most power are the least accessible. And so, as you're saying, a redistribution of the power would help. And like, I know that there are council members who are, can be more or less interested in education, responsive on education. The change in who the education chair is going to be will have some impact, and hopefully a positive one. But it would be great if the people who are, their whole job is education had more power in relation to education. I understand that the council members have everything else on their plate as well. As important as education might be to them personally, they've got everything else. So a redistribution of power seems to be in order.
I couldn't agree with Robert more, and that's coming from a council member, and not in a way it's like, oh no, we want to give up this power. It's because, I believe educators should be leading education. My school board member is Dr. Fraser O'Leary, who was even a teacher for 30 plus years. There is nothing that, there's no way as a council member that I can bring what Fraser O'Leary brings to the table, having been a teacher at Cardozo for 30 plus years, taught AP, was a coach. I mean, absolutely, Fraser O'Leary should have way more power as it relates to education than I do. That's just without a doubt. And so what I would like to see is educators leading education again. And for that to happen, it means that we have to redistribute power to the school board of education. And that's what I think the structural change has to be. Educators who know education, who understand education. It's ridiculous. I don't know how many council members have had education experience, but if you've never stepped into a classroom, you've never worked in a school, you've never been a parent of students who are in DC public schools or DC charter schools, you cannot, it's just the experience piece, you cannot really have an understanding how our structures are impacting and affecting all of our entities. So the absolute structure change has to be giving power back to the school board. And it's okay for, I know the facilities issue is something that people bring up. Oh, well, before, mayoral control, it was harder for schools to get modernized. Fine, leave modernization to the city council. That's where it should go. Let us do modernization. But when it comes to the actual, meat of what's happening in education, from standardized tests to grading, that needs to be with the school board of education, without a doubt.
That would be the real voice of the real reason to have a voice and representation. I mean, somebody who speaks to our experiences in those meetings and decision-making teams. Somebody who knows what's happening in our life, in our work.
I would also like DC public school teachers to be able to run for school boards. I think it's a huge hindrance, and that's another piece that comes into this. So the structure needs to change, the laws need to change around DC public school teachers being able to run, because I would like DC public school teachers to run for school board and not have to fear losing their job unless they are elected. We need them, to run. We need that perspective. And when they have to choose between their livelihood and job and the passion to be able to advocate for their community, it shouldn't have to be a choice. They should be able to do both. So I think that's the other piece that has to change if we're going to have what we consider, equitable and fair representation.
Ideal place yet. So yeah, that's one of the reasons why it's tough. Going back to the, how race and class factor into this, I have 2 points on that. So one is, I'm trying to move this out of the lights. Okay. So one is that some of the challenges that we have people don't want to acknowledge that they are part of the system, but they are part of the system. So for instance, each year, like when I started working with parents at then Orr Elementary, now Boone Elementary, to get that beautiful new building that's on Minnesota Avenue, and we were trying to figure out, well, what do we need to do, and where do we find in the budget, and who do we talk to? So just again, how hard it was to just even find the information that you need, that is a feature of the system. The information you need, who to talk to, like those are all features of the system. And then when we were sort of told by people, you need to go to the council budget hearing on the DCPS budget, because you really need to have a voice and have a presence there. It really is the only space in the city and the only time when you hear from across DCPS, and then people come with their laundry list. I mean, it's LSAT chair after LSAT chair. This just, brings these laundry lists of issues that people want. And then usually Grasso says, now, if you would just talk to my assistant over there, we'll be happy to help you with, figuring that out. And if you look at who signs up to testify, there's usually a huge gap between Ward 7 and 8 representation for who gets there. And I'm like, people don't pin it, but like, these are all features of the system. That if you have a council member who will jump in to the weeds of whatever your issue is and figure out what DGS needs to do in DCPS, like these are features of the system. So I think we also need some step back just from the arrows that are on the flow charts and some more diagnosis of the system as it's written and the system as, what's in between the lines. Because people, I've just been in so many conversations with people and I'm like, that is the system. That is the system itself, even if it's not written down. So the second part of my point on that is, so Ibram Kendi, who wrote Stand from the Beginning and How to Be Anti-Racist, he's very active on Twitter, which a lot of DC education people seem to be as well. So I hope everyone's following him. But one of the things that he's commented on a few times now that I just really think is so prescient and really applies to education is he said, because America really was founded with racism literally baked in, as we move to an anti-racist society, he's like, you're not going to recognize it. It's not going to, if we are going to challenge racism in this country, then society is going to look different. And I think that there's some parallels that we can draw as well, that systems and the way things work, are going to have to look different. And so I think, again, harkening back to our earlier point, what are we really trying to solve, I think is going to be another key piece of that. But I wanted to just kind of add some more context on the racism, classism connection and part of the conversation.
Thanks, Allison. That's actually such a perfect segue when you ask, society has to look different. What should it look like? From where you're sitting, what model or specific changes do you feel we would need to empower community voices in decision-making? And keeping in mind what Kathy and Allison are saying, that, we haven't fully identified the problem, but we know that community voice is a problem right now because it's not being uplifted. So what specific changes might we implement?
I sort of feel like we said a lot of them. Do you want us to go back and say them again?
I guess I'd want to think like in terms of like models of moving forward, right? So Kathy, you talked a lot about the Board of Education and how even back then it wasn't very responsive. So what's
No, I didn't say it wasn't responsive. I just was cautioning that it alone is not the answer. So I know you want to move us forward. So I think the only way we can move forward is to go back and say, okay, if and you want us to solve the problem of representation. And how we empower people. And then, but it sounds like then we're going straight to governance. I mean, I think we said we can empower people by having policies that require and that are enforced, that require that level. So even right now, before we tackle mayoral control, we could have some policies in place. We had to fight to get the hearing. The DCPS had to have a hearing on the budget. And they do hold that hearing. Whether actually they use the information that comes out of it is a different level, but maybe we would look at what policies do we need? Do we require the chancellor to have groups that include teachers and parents and community people in terms of any policy that
shorter term and longer term things? Doing something about principals getting fired because they're trying to defend and represent the people in their schools is a really important thing to do. Because these firings presumably are the tip of an iceberg, the part that got public. And there's a lot more going on, which is, I think, a lot of what LaJoy is saying.
And Ruth, the parents, they advocated, right? They were there, they were writing letters, they started a petition, they did all of these things, and I see Mark shaking his head, they still went on to hire somebody else. And so Ruth brings up a good point. I think many folks want to listen, but then we need to have a real conversation about retaliation and about how they just have to do what they're told. And that's a problem.
This conversation brings us perfectly to my next question about, and some of you have already mentioned this, but what model or specific changes would be best to empower community voices in our decision making? And then also my fifth question, which this could kind of go together if we'd like. I'll copy and paste it into the chat as well. And more broader, what changes at DCPS for the mayor, public charter school board, OSSE, the State Board of Education, or other agencies would bring about the changes you'd seek?
So part of the research I've been doing on governance structures was looking at school districts that have similar sizes to ours. So Baltimore, Columbus, and looking at the way that they structure it. And I think one of the ways to take away mayoral control would be to end in the game of politics, could be to split mayoral control with a school board. I think that I can only speak from DCPS viewpoint, but I think that having a school board elect a chancellor would balance out the values that between the schools, the stakeholders, and the mayor have. And then I think having some sort of committee that can recommend, but not necessarily have direct authority over the chancellor needs teacher opinion. We have Liz Davis, who does an unbelievable job representing teachers, but DCPS is so, or DC in general, is so diverse. The schools have such different needs. We need more teacher voice than we currently have. And so changing the structure from mayoral and school board combined of elected officials and getting more creative with what a school board would entail. Having teachers on the school board, having parents on the school board, having ward members, having at-large members, having community members from the Chamber of Commerce. So involving all the stakeholders on the school board in conjunction with the mayor, I think would.
On this. But, I hold an 8-hour hearing where people are coming in and giving their input. They may not ultimately agree with whatever decision that we made, but we create the space to have the conversations and we engage in the conversations and no one gets dismissed. And that goes a long way to that. So I think that when we think about the education committee and whatever it's gonna look like come January, I think that we need to have an expectation that the council's gotta do a better job of its job, period, in terms of oversight, engagement, hearings, all of that. And that's at least inwardly for me, one of the things that I think has to happen as we move into next year. And that's set aside from, big governance change, things like that. Just even with what we've got, we have to do a better job.
Jessica, I remember you asking this question when the kind of transparency conversation was happening about what other steps could we take to strengthen kind of accountability and transparency. And I don't think that the state board has to have budgetary, I don't think that has to happen. I do think that what I've recommended and what I think is important is for the board to be able to call upon the chancellor, like just as a matter of norms. The chancellor, LEA heads, and the charter side have to be compelled to come before the state board and answer questions and be accountable to the elected school board. That is a fix that to me shouldn't be that controversial, right? The State Board of Education, Chairman Mendelson asked Ruth this maybe last year about, should the state board have a say-so in developing the facilities management plan? And, that's the sort of responsibility that I think, because State Board of Education members walk through these facilities, know these facilities better than almost anybody. That's a space where I think it's like common sense. Why not, right? Being able to appoint the state superintendent. That may be a little bit more on this is a little bit more controversial side, but if we are dictating policy to this person, or at the very least being able to confirm who the mayor picks, because you all work with that person more than anybody else. Allowing the State Board of Education to pass on to the council, have its own hearings about who the chancellor should be, and be able to say up or down, like on a resolution, that we support or do not support this person that the mayor has put forward. Now that's a symbolic kind of check, but it's an important one, because people will be able to say, well, the State Board of Education, the body tasked with at least part-time, you have a part-time body, doing this work, doesn't have confidence in the person that the mayor put forward. And big structural changes, I think the one body that is a black hole of accountability and transparency, and it has to be said, the Public Charter School Board. It has got to be said. That has got to be said. And we really need to look at how we authorize, how we appoint members, all of those good things that people have complained about. Because as of right now, it is a black hole for transparency and accountability.
A follow-up to that about how charter teachers can be certified for DC, because the way the charter school system functions right now, it prevents mobility for teachers, and therefore prevents teachers from being able to hold their schools and the charter board more accountable at all levels.
I think I do want to say too, on top of it, I definitely agree with Ron, where it's like appointing these like deputy mayor, state superintendent, like very similar as to like state board, DC council, is really a great way to build trust for the community. And I do also want to say that just having like a place where parents, teachers, students can express about issues is something that I mean, I've been teaching in DC for 6 years now, and I've worked in charter and DCPS, and I have not seen any type of like town hall, community forum on a regular basis, not even just like a one-time thing. Like I just have never seen that at all. And so like, I think really having just like a local, like as local as you can, gives the most power, because I think at the end of the day, it comes to power, right? If we give the power to our parents,
an education point or talking point or piece to the community is like, well, this is why we can't move forward, because we don't have centralized education and only one person. So I think that could be an element of, showing people, if we had some central, I don't know, independent agency around education, we could have moved maybe faster or more coherently around the issue. So maybe just basically using this as an example, because I think it's very tangible to everyone right now.
Thank you.
I mean, I think that, like Carlene said, building on things that are out there makes sense, but picking one or two key things that can be addressed in the coming council period around which you can organize that are intuitive and could be powerful, because folks need something very specific in order to rally around it, not just a kind of concept of that we need to move off of mayoral control. So take the data from this, take the data from other places, and figure out what are the one or two initiatives that you want to pursue in the next 6 months.
Great. And given our timing, these are some awesome ideas. I've made sure to gather everything and to continue building off that. What do we think as a group right now, those one or two things are? Like, what can we, really concretize to say, this should be the focus in, the beginning of 2021?
I'd like to see EmpowerEd organize around reforming the state board's composition. I think Fraser spoke to it earlier. I think it's a clear point within former teacher, no longer teacher. I can't speak for that community exactly anymore, but that's a clear, specific issue that is not fair. And I think, in my opinion, I think it's right in the bailiwick of EmpowerEd to elevate that as an issue. I hope.
Thank you, Will. Go for it, Brian.
It seems to me, just as as somebody who is new to this space and as a stakeholder, as a teacher, and as a community member, I feel like data transparency is a really salient or obvious point to stress to community members and to stakeholders. That seems like a very low threshold issue to overcome. I could be totally wrong. I don't know the legal red tape wrapped up in that, but being forced to share data and share data honestly and transparently and on command is, I think, a thing that EmpowerEd could stand for.
Am I right that one of the things that's going to be happening is we need a new OSSI? Has somebody been appointed to be the next OSSI? So, we're going to have confirmation hearings around a new head of OSSI. And so in parallel to that, thinking about how OSSI fits into the landscape, I think it would be a shame if that wasn't part of the consideration of who's the next OSSI. And it may mean that may provide an opening for some empowerment of the state board relative to OSSI in parallel to the confirmation of a new OSSI.
Awesome, thank you. Any additional thoughts on this point? So I know we've talked about some structural issues in that piece.
Whatever, where those entities are filled with different voices, with representative of everyone concerned, all the stakeholders, but then that measure of authority to actually meter out and implement those changes that are coming. What does that look like? How is that started, so that we're not just continuing to talk about this stuff over and over and over again, but we're starting to see real life and real changes happen because there's a measure of authority that these different groups, these different entities do have to bring more financing to the school, to make sure that the teachers are more diverse, to make sure the curriculum is more representative of the student population within DC, to make sure that the after school needs of some of these kids are also being
Push the close button on everybody.
You're doing a lot of logistics. Appreciate it.
It's all good.
All right.
Did you see Patricia's message?
Yeah.
Okay.
Welcome back, everyone. We'll make sure everyone has a chance to come back in. It's awesome to see everyone's face with live videos on now. We'll give everyone just a second to finish up with their rooms.
We were kicked out of our room, Scott.
I'm sorry.
No, it's no problem. But I do want to hear Emily's. She had one statement that I wanted to hear the completion of.
Well, maybe she can give your group report and add it on.
Good. Perfect.
So I think we will. I'm actually going to ask Chanel to name each group. Just give us the facilitator name. And when Chanel says the facilitator name, we'll have one person from each group give us 1 minute. Let's shoot for 1 minute because it will be 2 or 3. Report back from each group, very high level. And then we're going to get a chance for everyone to share some final ideas digitally. So Chanel, why don't you call a group?
Yeah, I'm going to go in order. So be warned. So that means if you were in group 1, Nicole Baum's group, you are up.
We didn't talk about someone being the official group reporter, so I can summarize for us. It was such a wonderful conversation about how all of these issues are just coming together, and really I heard a lot about the lack of the communication, the lack of public engagement, and really we spoke about how you know, how much access do we give to the public to organize, or is that the necessary responsibility of the people, or should leaders themselves really understand that it's their job to communicate with the public, it's their job to listen to us and to know, like, to effectively communicate what's going on so that we understand, and how can we be a part of decision making in the city. And I think that's probably my time. So that's what we spoke about mostly.
All right, thank you. Next is group 2, which would be James's group.
Hey everyone. So first of all, shout out to my group for having just like an awesome continuous conversation. It was really, really helpful, not only just to hear, I think as like a teacher, I often hear like the ground level, but also hearing just like many like the officials and people that are activists involved in the area, hearing their thoughts and ideas. And so we talked a lot about just like, not only just like how do we build trust for everyone, like, I mean, really just from like the top down, but also talking a lot about just what kind of structures that we can feel empowered. I think that was something that was a major part of our conversation is this like, how do we build trust for everyone? So like teachers, parents, students, principals, elected officials. I mean, just really from like, from all aspects of just the DC education's landscape, but just how do we build trust for everyone? Because if you build that trust, then now there'll be more engagements.
Next group, thank you, James, is Maya's group.
We also did not decide who would present, but I can present. So we really looked at kind of the levels, starting from really like school-based all the way up to council, of what are the obstacles. And a big thing that came out was transparency. So people receiving different messages. So council hearing things that are different from what teachers and students are saying and feeling. And so really thinking of how do we redistribute the power so that not all the power is in one place, and that those who are making decisions around education are really those with the expertise, those who have been teachers, have worked in education, and have wider access to students, families, teachers, community members, and that it even moves down to, as the local level at schools, of what is the curriculum that we're using and who are the people that are teaching our students, and really making sure that we're making an effort to not only give power to everybody, but really to the first step in empowering our young people really comes from ensuring that they have teachers and curriculum that reflects themselves and their own experiences as well. So that was a lot of our conversation as well. And again, shout out to our group. A lot of really good thinking.
Thank you. Group 4 is Ben's group.
All right, thank you. I just want to say that I was really grateful. I'm very grateful and inspired by our conversation. We had a wealth of ideas. So to share, to fill people in, some ideas that came out are that the State Board of Education is currently a poster child of lack of power in our city, and that incrementally increasing its power, would serve our communities, and would serve, our families very well. The theme of the lack of checks and balances in the DC education system was very salient, and that it's very hard to make the system responsive right now, given a lot of the structures that are in place. We talked a little bit about the structural underfunding of DCPS, and there was a really great idea shared that charter school teachers don't necessarily need to be against expanding charter schools, but we don't need to open new schools if there isn't a need. If schools aren't closing, why are we opening new schools? So a couple other specific ideas was just to really build on the grassroots power that we already have and realize that there is tremendous effort and engagement already in the city. And that we can continue the pushes around data transparency, around making sure that the systems, both charter and DCPS have similar governance structures and that these aren't two totally, completely separate worlds. And then also the new Aussie, head of Aussie, who, will have confirmation hearings and making sure that elected officials are responsive to someone that will best serve the DC community.
Next up, group 5 is Issa's group.
Hi, everyone. I was in group 5, and shout out for everyone in group 5 for fostering such a rich conversation. Hard to summarize it in 1 minute, but I think we can say that in group 5, not one person felt that they were heard as community members in the DC education system as it is right now. And one thing that we kept coming back to is that there really are no robust democratic processes in place to foster community engagement as the system is right now. And that before we can really kind of move forward to saying this is a model that will solve this problem, we really need to understand why those processes don't exist. And so when we spoke about values, we really spoke about having people in power who have a learning mindset or who have a humility and a willingness to want to hear from their community consistently. And that right now, that's pretty much what's missing, right? There's no accountability and there's no sort of process to do that. And I think something that really struck me about what my group talked about is that sometimes when we think of like a really strong system, we think of a person who fosters these values. But what we really want is a system that kind of transcends like one individual who fosters the value of democratic processes. Like we need something that will be sustainable. And so I think where we landed was that we really just need to kind of look deep into our history and into ourselves and think about why is the system trying to shut out community voices. And one thing that Allison brought up is just that there are so many studies that show that in order to be really democratic, like the system will take longer, right? In order to include lots of community voices, there's kind of this inverse relationship between like the speed in which things get done and the level of democracy. And that doesn't mean that it can't be done. It just means that it will look very different. So thank you, Allison, for bringing up that really important point.
Thank you. Next is Liz Koenig's group.
That was funny, Issa, that you said that, because we also had a discussion about willingness. Our student voice definitely talked about the willingness to engage. And how that's so important to this whole conversation. We had a really good discussion as well. I really liked when we talked about the values that we wanted to see. We talked about equity and parent engagement, student representation, and equal representation for like all parties affected. We had a discussion about student councils and PTAs and how important they are to school communities and to voice. And the word humility was also brought up as a value to see in the system, which I thought was very interesting, and the humility to know that the leaders are not the ones with the only ideas or the ones with the most important ideas, and the humility to know that you have to have that willingness to engage. We had a few different ideas about changes to make, such as changing LSATs back to LSRTs. I think I got that acronym right. When LSATs had more actual power, the principal had to go along with whatever the committee said instead of it just being advisory. And that really, we talked about being most disempowered when when we have a voice, but then we're actually not listened to, that fake power you have on paper that actually doesn't translate into real power. And so ways to make that more formalized, giving formalized roles of power to teachers, parents, and students in agencies. And also kind of figuring out right now, I really liked this idea, right now, what agencies do we have and what values that we say are important are they showing, and then what can we do to change that? And I just want to say that another Another word that came up a lot was transparency. That power to get information among all these players in the system is so important to being able to make the changes we need. And we heard how the SBOE, can't even get the information it needs, and the AMCs might have more power than SBOE to get information from agencies, which is, one minor change you could make right away that would do a lot to change the system that we have now. So thank you, everybody.
The next group is Giselle's group.
Hi, everyone. Just echoing my colleagues' rich conversation. Super grateful for my group members. And I was actually just going through and just writing down bullet points that came up from our conversation. So some of the things that came up were, for question number 1, just an overall sense of feeling unempowered or not having a feeling of empowerment due to the power structures that are currently in play. For number 2, someone said the value is seeing people who have done the job making decisions. So what does it mean that our current mayor has never taught and now she is the leader of our education system? A commitment to anti-racism, a commitment to having high quality schools everywhere in the city, not just one section of the city. A commitment to safety, not meaning more officers in our school, but nurses and multiple mental health professionals. Let's see, what else? Sorry, it was just so much. I appreciated for question number 3, someone brought up that they were struggling with the question, not because of the question, a flaw in the question, but more so because of who is our educational leader, right? And like a lot of people actually do not know who that person is. And there are all these other layers or people who are presented as our educational leaders, but when you get down to it, it's really the mayor. And so what model or specific change would best empower community voices? I'll just end on this. Somebody said wanting our local school board of education and having that over DCPS and the public charter school board, and having more of a coordinated planning and relationship between DCPS and our public charter school board, since both are very present in the district. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Giselle. Greta, you're up. Or someone from Greta's group.
We also had a really amazing group with a lot of rich conversation. We started out by naming a few barriers that we experience in trying to advocate for our educational system. One of them was secrecy. We have all experienced pat answers from the chancellor or the mayor or various agencies, or conflicting answers. Another barrier in that vein being not knowing which agencies are responsible for what, not knowing where to turn to have your voice heard, not knowing where or how to advocate, because there's so much going on and it can be hard to interpret. Along that line also, we talked about the frustration and inequity and inaccessibility of feeling like you can't contribute unless you understand the nuances of DC educational policy or have a degree in educational policy. And that obviously is a large barrier, as many of us here today do not, and yet it's important that our voices are heard. Another barrier that we named was the perception and the reality that white stakeholder voices tend to have more influence than voices of color in our district. Some ways that we strategized to change and overcome these barriers were that we need access to data regarding our public and charter schools, and that this pandemic should teach us that all roundtables, all council member meetings, etc., any policymaking meeting should be accessible virtually, because a large barrier is having to show up somewhere physically. But if you can call in or Zoom in to these council member meetings or roundtables, we're likely to have a much more representative, we're likely to have more people there from various wards that might not have attended otherwise. We talked about the desire for system overhaul, but knowing that that's for the long game. And in the meantime, I may be working together with a lot of the people here today to create a list of some of the short-term issues that we know can be solved in the short term and presenting it to our council members, particularly during this time of council member turnover. If anyone from our group would like to add something, go ahead. That's what I had written down.
I'm going to, well, Patricia's group is next. She had to leave for a little bit. So if anyone is interested, that would be groups, I think 9 or 10, maybe Collin, you can step in here.
Yeah, I'll step in. So shout out to Emily and Liz Davis and other folks in our group. Very quickly, I think a lot of it has been said already, but I think, and we talked a lot of issues, I think, especially as it relates to COVID, but I think a core of the issues that we have now is a lot of the information. I think there's a lot of good information and there's a lot of novel ideas of how to deal with reopening, and probably even beyond, have been, that are being talked about, but I think a key problem is a lot of those ideas are kind of being filtered up to the top, which has essentially become a black hole of information being lost as far as what they want to have represented within the district or not. And the media kind of perpetuating this kind of like misuse of information to where schools are kind of, trying to figure things out. And then, so right now there's just a lot of all hands on deck and people trying to fend for themselves, which I think in a lot of ways is kind of on purpose, so that while we're all kind of struggling against each other, the people at the top, are just kind of sitting back and kind of calling all the shots. Whereas there needs to be better systems where instead of all these information that kind of filtered up to the top, that kind of fostered among each other, if we want to consider DCPS and charter schools as a team collective, like having better communication among schools as far as colleagues within our education system, where we're able to share these ideas collectively, and collectively as teachers, parents, and stakeholders, local stakeholders, we're able to elevate those ideas and our priorities to the top and kind of demand from our stakeholders that these are the values that collectively as people who are invested in the lives of our students, that we demand from you to help us with. And if you're not able to help us with these things, then we are not going to consider you for those positions. So I think there has to be better ways, and we didn't necessarily come up with ideas right now, but how can we better foster those ideas and, and ways that we're able to better collaborate among schools, communities, among each other. So it's not just certain communities are doing one things and others are not, but then also kind of bring those ideas together as far as what is the possibilities collectively as a district? What are the issues that schools are facing, so that collectively we can kind of come together and figure out, oh, this might work in my community, this thing might not. But I think having that form of ideas that we're able to kind of elevate to the top as a more cohesive unit versus school versus school against school, community versus community, within families among families.
Can I just add that the WTU is actually forming a forum, Liz, you can correct me, but something that will help to empower LSAT leaders or parents, which I think is a really important piece of the puzzle. And it's been brought up several times that LSATs should have a stronger role in our system. So that's one. And I just think using the press more is an important piece of the puzzle as well, and getting the message out there, because they should be able to help us say what actually needs to be said.
Thank you. And President Davis, if you have a link to that you want us to send out to everyone in follow-up, I'd be happy to do that.
Actually, I wanted to submit the schedule for those LSAT trainings. And I do want to thank the individual who mentioned the need to return to the local school restructuring team, because that is one of our proposals in our contract negotiations, to give the local school restructuring teams more authority in decision-making and serve more than just an advisory committee.
Thank you.
So what I will do, Scott, is forward you the schedule of those LSATs ward to ward. And we're doing it basically starting all the elementary schools in each ward across the state.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all the groups and our group leaders. I dropped a few things into the chat. We're going to do one more thing before folks drop off, if you have a second. One is we will send out notes afterwards from each of the groups, a summary of the group conversations. If you want to support, you appreciate it with the teacher leaders who are in your group are doing, you want to continue to support them. One of the things we're trying to focus on is increasingly getting more and more training for them as advocates and organizers. There's a link I dropped in just a little bit ago to support them by giving. Also masks and shirts and other ways you can support. And I also put in a reading list that we are using to wade through these issues of mayoral control and school governance that our teacher fellows are looking at. We'd love to have reading partners contribute thoughts along. Real quick, before we end, we're gonna do a quick Menti for those who may be familiar, doing a lot of digital learning. So I'm gonna throw this up here. I'm gonna ask everyone either on your phone or on your computer, if you can open another tab and go to menti.com. You can put in that code, and we're gonna do 2 quick questions on here. So one is a quick poll, and then one powerful idea that you're taking from today. So I'll let folks go ahead and log in. So menti.com, put in the code 994333, and then you can go ahead and start on this one. We'll give this a minute. Menti.com, and then the code is 994333. I'll give just another second on this one. Appreciate folks weighing in. And obviously we're going to go to the really deep substance that's in your notes to follow up and have our teacher leaders begin to work together with the community members, the students, teachers, parents, and both present here and not on this vision. And finally, I want to go to one powerful idea that you took from today. So I'm going to stop the share for 1 second. You should be able to, let's see, you can go to the next one. All right. So this next one, I'm going to throw it up now, is just kind of the most powerful idea that you're leaving today with. What was the one powerful idea that stood out to you most from this morning, now going into this afternoon? Does everyone see that question now? There you go. Give one more minute for folks to respond. All right, I'm going to stop the share. Please continue to share ideas there. Please continue to share ideas with us. First of all, thank you so much to the 90 people who came out for having such great diverse representation of our city and our stakeholders. Thank you for your contributions to the conversations. A big thank you to all of our teacher organizers who did so much work in preparing for this and in facilitating and leading conversations today. You know, we really saw during this past year, going into this year, it was not our plan to take on this issue. You know, we were involved in teacher diversity and COVID response, and as we especially saw the response to COVID, the conversations over reopening, our teacher leaders thought it was really clear that there was a root cause, right? That we really needed to step back and think about why is it that when we keep testifying, our parents, our teachers, our students, we hear so much frustration. There's 60 people showing up to a state board of education meeting, and you're hearing all that frustration poured out. What can we actually do, right, to address that root cause, right, to make our system more responsive to the people it should be responsive to? So I appreciate everyone for joining us in this conversation. We'll send out notes and continue the conversation. I hope that all of you will continue to join us as we and our teacher think of new solutions. Yes. Yes, go ahead.
And this is just for, and I will share the details with you later, but we are doing a tutoring program for hotel and restaurant workers with Unite here. It will be virtual, but we'll need teachers, early grade teachers, pre-K through 6. And I'm going to share that information with you once we've laid out the schedule. They will be paid a stipend, and of course they'll be working with groups not larger than 3 students. So I will share that information with you, and we're going to poll our members as well.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to everyone for coming today. Have a great Saturday, great weekend.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Nice job. Go have a fun day.
I'm the host. So I'm going to just end it.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.